The mahogany table in my parents' dining room had never felt so cold. October rain drummed against the bay windows of their Beacon Hill townhouse, casting shifting shadows across the Persian rug that had been in our family for 3 generations. But nothing about this moment felt familiar, despite sitting in the same chair where I'd eaten countless Sunday dinners. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My father, Robert Caldwell, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and slid a manila folder across the polished surface. His movements were precise, calculated, the same way he'd handled board meetings for 30 years before retiring as CEO of Caldwell Industries. Beside him, my mother, Patricia, sat with her hands folded, her pearl necklace catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. "Open it, James," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone I'd learned to recognize as a child, the one that meant the conversation was already over, and I just hadn't realized it yet. Inside the folder were legal documents, photocopies of my grandfather's will, and what appeared to be a financial analysis printed on letterhead from Morrison and Associates, the family's longtime law firm. My grandfather, Theodore Caldwell, had passed away 6 months earlier at the age of 91. He'd built a modest hardware business into a multi-million-dollar empire, and everyone knew his estate was substantial. What I hadn't expected was seeing my name highlighted in yellow across multiple pages. $50 million, my father said, his fingers drumming once against the table. That's what Theodore left you directly. Not through us. Not through the family trust. Directly to you. I looked up from the papers, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The number felt abstract, impossibly large, like something from a news headline about lottery winners or tech billionaires. My grandfather had been generous throughout his life, paying for my college at Northwestern, helping with my first apartment in Chicago, sending birthday checks that were always more than they needed to be. But $50 million was beyond anything I'd imagined. There's a problem, though, Patricia continued, her manicured fingers now fidgeting with her wedding ring. The inheritance comes with expectations. Family expectations. My younger sister, Stephanie, shifted in her chair across from me. At 26, she was 2 years younger than me but had always carried herself like she was entitled to things I'd had to work for. She'd majored in art history at Brown, spent 2 years finding herself in Europe, and had recently moved back into the family home while pursuing what she called creative projects. She hadn't looked directly at me since I'd arrived. "What kind of expectations?" I asked, though something in my stomach was already twisting. Robert cleared his throat. "Your grandfather was old-fashioned about certain things. Family unity, shared responsibility, taking care of your relatives. He may have left the money to you, but we all know he intended for it to benefit the family as a whole." The rain outside seemed to grow louder, or maybe it was just that the silence in the room had become so thick I could hear everything else more clearly. I set the papers down carefully, the way you might handle something that could explode. "What are you asking me to do?" Patricia's smile was the same one she'd used when I was 12, and she'd explained why I couldn't have the bicycle I wanted for my birthday, patient, condescending, like she was doing me a favor by managing my disappointment. "We think it would be appropriate for you to establish a family fund. Stephanie has some wonderful ideas for her gallery project, and your father and I have been discussing some investment opportunities that could benefit everyone." "A gallery," I repeated, looking at my sister for the first time since the conversation began. She was staring at her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be Instagram posts of art installations. "It's more than just a gallery," Stephanie said without looking up. "It's a cultural space. Experimental, boundary-pushing. The kind of place Boston needs if it's going to be taken seriously as an arts destination." My father nodded approvingly. "Stephanie has identified a property in the South End. With the right backing, it could be transformative. Of course, that kind of vision requires substantial capital." I found myself thinking about my apartment in Chicago, the one-bedroom place in Lincoln Park where I'd lived for the past 4 years while working as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company. My rent was $1,800 a month, and I'd been proud of being able to afford it without help from my parents. I drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic, cooked most of my meals at home, and had managed to save enough money to take exactly one vacation in the past 2 years, a long weekend in Nashville with college friends. The distance between my life and $50 million felt vast, but not in the way my parents seemed to assume. It wasn't that I couldn't imagine having that much money. It was that I couldn't imagine wanting to live the kind of life that much money seemed to require. "How much are we talking about for this gallery?" I asked. Stephanie finally looked up from her phone. "The property is $7.5 million. Then there's renovation, installation, marketing, staff." She waved her hand vaguely. Probably 12 million to do it right. But that's just the initial investment. To really establish it as a destination, we'd need operating capital for at least the first 3 years. So $20 million, I said. For a gallery. For a cultural institution, Patricia corrected. Something the family could be proud of. Something with lasting impact. My father leaned back in his chair, and I recognized the expression on his face, the same one he'd worn when he'd tried to convince me to major in business instead of computer science, or when he'd suggested I should consider working for one of his former colleagues instead of wasting time with startups and technology companies. James, you have to understand the position this puts us in, he said. Your grandfather's will has been created an imbalance. Stephanie has worked just as hard in her field as you have in yours. Your mother and I have spent decades building relationships and maintaining the family reputation. But now, through no fault of our own, you're in a position to either strengthen those bonds or, well, to create resentment that could last for generations. The word resentment hung in the air like smoke. I could feel the weight of it, the implication that my grandfather's decision to leave me his money was somehow my fault, something I needed to fix. And if I don't want to fund the gallery? I asked. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses in the conversation. This one felt sharp, like the moment before a door slams. Stephanie set her phone down on the table with a deliberate click. Then I guess we'll know where your priorities are. Stephanie, Patricia said, but her tone was more cautionary than disapproving. No, Mom, I think it's important to be clear about this. My sister's voice had taken on an edge I'd heard before, usually when she wasn't getting something she wanted. James has always acted like he's different from us, like he's somehow more authentic because he lives in Chicago and works for some tech company nobody's heard of. But now he has the chance to actually contribute to something meaningful, and his first instinct is to question it. I felt something shift inside my chest, a familiar sensation from childhood, the feeling of being cornered, of having my motivations questioned not because of what I'd done, but because of what I hadn't agreed to do quickly enough. I didn't say I wasn't going to help, I said carefully. I just want to understand what we're talking about. Robert picked up another document from the folder, this one with more numbers, more highlighted sections. There's also the matter of taxes, estate planning, proper wealth management. $50 million isn't the kind of money you can just leave sitting in a checking account. It requires structure, professional oversight, and strategic distribution. As he spoke, I found myself looking around the dining room where we'd sat for so many family meals. The oil painting above the sideboard was of my great-grandfather, Theodore's father, who'd started the family business with a single hardware store in Somerville. His expression in the painting was serious but kind, the face of someone who'd worked with his hands and understood the value of things built slowly, carefully. What would he think about this conversation? About his great-great-granddaughter wanting $12 million for an art gallery, about his family treating an inheritance like a resource to be divided among competing projects. I need to see the actual will, I said. Patricia's expression tightened slightly. Of course. Though I should mention that Morrison and Associates has already reviewed everything. There are no ambiguities about your grandfather's intentions. What does that mean, exactly? My father exchanged a glance with my mother, one of those married couple communications that happen in a fraction of a second. It means that while the money is legally yours, Theodore made certain statements to William Morrison about his hopes for how the inheritance would be used. Family unity was very important to him, James. Especially after your grandmother died. I remembered my grandmother, Eleanor, who'd passed away when I was 15. She'd been the one who taught me to play chess, who'd insisted I read actual books instead of just playing video games, who'd taken me to museums in Boston and New York and talked to me about art and history like my opinions mattered. She'd also been the one who'd quietly encouraged me to follow my own interests, even when they didn't align with family expectations. What kind of statements? Nothing legally binding, Robert said quickly. But he expressed concern about young people today lacking a sense of responsibility to their families. He worried about individualism replacing family loyalty. The irony wasn't lost on me. My grandfather, who'd built his fortune through individual determination and business innovation, apparently worried about individualism. But then again, maybe that wasn't ironic. Maybe it was just the natural evolution of family wealth. The first generation earns it, the second generation manages it, and the third generation fights over it. Stephanie had picked up her phone again. But I could tell she was still listening. Her jaw was set in a way that meant she was getting impatient with the conversation, ready for it to move from discussion to decision. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I'd like to read the will myself, I said. And I'd like to talk To Morrison about those statements you mentioned. Of course, Patricia said, though her smile had become more forced. Though I hope you understand that the family is excited about these opportunities. Stephanie has worked very hard on the gallery proposal, and there are time-sensitive aspects to the property acquisition. How time-sensitive? The seller wants a decision by the end of November, Stephanie said, finally engaging directly with the conversation again. Real estate in the South End doesn't stay on the market long, especially properties with the kind of character and potential this one has. 6 weeks. They wanted me to commit to funding a $20 million project in 6 weeks, based on a conversation in my parents' dining room and a folder of documents I'd had 20 minutes to review. I looked at the papers again, scanning the legal language and financial projections. Everything was professionally prepared, thoroughly researched, convincingly presented. But something about the timing bothered me. My grandfather died in April. It was now October. Why was this conversation happening now, with this particular urgency? When did you first see these documents? I asked, another glance between my parents. William Morrison contacted us in August, Robert said. There were some delays with the estate, probate issues, that sort of thing. But everything's been resolved now. 2 months. They'd known about this inheritance for 2 months, had time to research gallery properties and prepare financial projections and schedule meetings with lawyers, but I was hearing about it for the first time today, with a 6-week deadline attached. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I need time to process this. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. Stephanie set her phone down harder than necessary. Time to process what, exactly? It's pretty straightforward, James. You have money. The family has needs. And opportunities. You can either be part of the solution or what? She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. Be part of the solution, or be the problem. Fund the gallery and the investments and whatever other family projects would inevitably follow, or become the person who chose money over family, self-interest over loyalty. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Outside, the October rain had intensified, turning the windows into streams of water that distorted the view of Beacon Hill's gaslit streets. This was the neighborhood where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to ride a bicycle on brick sidewalks and walk to the common on summer evenings. But standing in my parents' dining room, looking at their expectant faces and my sister's barely concealed frustration, I felt like a stranger. I'll call Morrison tomorrow, I said. Set up a meeting to go over everything. James, Patricia said, her voice softer now, more maternal. You know we only want what's best for the family. Your grandfather trusted you with this responsibility. Because he believed you'd do the right thing. The right thing. As if there was only one right thing, and they'd already determined what it was. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair and headed toward the foyer. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of urgent conversation, my parents and sister already planning their next approach. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about my grandfather, about the hardware store he'd started with borrowed money. And determination, about the empire he'd built not by asking for handouts or expecting family members to fund his dreams, but by working longer and smarter than everyone else. What would he really want me to do with $50 million? And more importantly, what did I want to do with it? Standing in the foyer, pulling on my jacket, I realized I already knew the answer to at least one of those questions. Whatever I decided about the money, it wouldn't be based on guilt, family pressure, or 6-week ultimatums delivered over cold coffee in a dining room that suddenly felt more like a boardroom than a home. The Morrison and Associates office occupied 3 floors of a granite building in downtown Boston's financial district. William Morrison himself was in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of gravitas that comes from 50 years of handling wealthy families' most delicate matters. His corner office overlooked Boston Harbor, and on this gray November morning, I could see cargo ships moving slowly through the choppy water. Your grandfather was very specific about his wishes, Morrison said, sliding a leather portfolio across his mahogany desk. But I think it's important you understand the context of those wishes. Inside the portfolio was the original will, not the photocopied excerpts my parents had shown me. As I read through the formal legal language, one thing became immediately clear: there were no conditions attached to my inheritance. No requirements to consult with family members, no mandates to fund specific projects, no obligations to share the money with anyone. $50 million, free and clear, Morrison continued, watching me read. Your grandfather was adamant about that. He'd seen too many family fortunes destroyed by complicated trusts and competing interests. I looked up from the will. But my father mentioned statements you said my grandfather made about family unity. Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, his expression thoughtful. Your grandfather did express concerns about modern individualism, yes. But James, you need to understand what prompted those concerns. 3 years ago, your cousin Bradley filed a lawsuit against the family trust, claiming he was entitled to a larger distribution. The legal fees alone cost the family nearly $2 million, and the relationships. Well, let's just say Thanksgiving dinners became considerably smaller. I remembered Bradley, my father's nephew, who'd always seemed bitter about his place in the family hierarchy. The lawsuit had been mentioned in passing during family gatherings, but I hadn't understood the scope of it. Your grandfather's solution was elegant in its simplicity, Morrison continued. Rather than create another complicated trust that could be challenged or manipulated, he gave you direct ownership. His hope was that you'd use the money wisely, but the definition of wisely was left entirely to your judgment. The implications were sinking in. My parents had presented their demands as if they were somehow legally or morally ordained by my grandfather's wishes, but the reality was much different. The money was mine, period. What I chose to do with it was my decision alone. There's something else you should know, Morrison said, pulling another document from his desk drawer. Your grandfather left similar gifts to other family members. Your parents received $5 million each. Stephanie received $2 million. Your cousin Bradley, despite the lawsuit, received $1 million. I stared at the numbers on the page. My parents already had $10 million between them, and they were pressuring me to fund Stephanie's gallery project with another $20 million from my inheritance. The scale of their entitlement was breathtaking. Did they mention their own inheritance when they spoke to you about yours? Morrison asked. No, I said quietly. They didn't. Morrison nodded, unsurprised. Your grandfather anticipated this might happen. Wealthy families often develop complicated dynamics around money. He hoped that by being generous to everyone, he could prevent resentment. But he was also realistic about human nature. I spent the rest of the morning in Morrison's office, going through financial projections, tax implications, and investment options. The lawyer was thorough and patient, answering every question I had about managing such a large sum of money. But what struck me most was what he didn't say. There was no pressure, no timeline, no suggestion that I owed anyone anything. When I left the office, Boston's financial district was bustling with lunch hour activity. Bankers and lawyers hurried past in expensive suits, talking on phones about deals and deadlines. I walked slowly toward the harbor, my mind processing everything I'd learned. My phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie, gallery owner wants answer by Friday. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Then another from my mother, Morrison's office called to confirm your appointment. Hope you got the clarification you needed. Looking forward to moving forward together. The presumption in that last message was stunning. As if the meeting with Morrison was just a formality, a rubber stamp on decisions that had already been made for me. I found myself at the harbor's edge, looking out at the dark water. A ferry was pulling away from the dock, loaded with tourists, heading to the islands. I watched it disappear into the distance and thought about my grandfather, about the man who'd built something from nothing and then chosen to trust me with the fruits of his labor. That evening, I drove back to my parents' house. This time, I didn't call ahead. I found them in the living room, the same formal space where we'd gathered for holiday mornings and birthday celebrations throughout my childhood. Robert was reading the Wall Street Journal, while Patricia worked on a crossword puzzle. Stephanie was sprawled across the antique sofa, laptop open, surrounded by what appeared to be architectural drawings and color swatches. James. Patricia looked up with a bright smile. What a lovely surprise. I was just about to call you. Did Morrison clear everything up? I remained standing in the doorway, not taking off my jacket. He did. Very enlightening conversation. Stephanie closed her laptop and sat up straighter. Perfect timing. I've got the final contracts from the gallery space, and the architect has some incredible ideas for the renovation. We could break ground by January if we move quickly. I'm not funding the gallery, I said. The words came out more bluntly than I'd intended, but there was something liberating about their directness. No explanations, no apologies, just a simple statement of fact. The silence that followed was profound. Robert slowly folded his newspaper and set it aside. Patricia's pen hovered over her crossword puzzle, frozen mid-word. Stephanie's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and then something harder. What do you mean? Patricia asked, her voice carefully controlled. I mean, I'm not giving you $20 million to fund Stephanie's art gallery. Or any amount, for that matter. Stephanie stood up from the sofa, her architectural drawings scattering to the floor. James, you can't be serious. We've already put down earnest money on the property. I've been working on this for months. With what money? I asked. Because Morrison told me something interesting today. He told me that he inherited $2 million from grandfather. And that mom and dad each got 5 million. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Robert and Patricia exchanged one of their wordless glances, but this one was different from the calculated communications I'd witnessed the week before. This one looked like panic. Morrison shouldn't have. Robert began. Shouldn't have told me the truth? I interrupted. That while you were pressuring me to fund family projects, you were sitting on $10 million of your own inheritance? Patricia set down her crossword puzzle with deliberate care. James, you're oversimplifying things. That money has already been allocated for retirement planning, long-term care insurance, and maintaining this house. Maintaining a house that's worth what, $3 million? $4 million? On Beacon Hill real estate, probably more. I was surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. And you want me to believe that $10 million isn't enough to cover your expenses, so I need to contribute $20 million for Stephanie's hobby? It's not a hobby, Stephanie snapped. It's a legitimate business venture. And if you'd actually listen to the presentation instead of running to Morrison like some paranoid. I read your business plan, I said, cutting her off. You're projecting that the gallery will lose money for at least the first 3 years. The revenue estimates are based on conservative growth in Boston's contemporary art market, which, according to your own research, has been declining for the past 5 years. You're not asking me to invest in a business. You're asking me to subsidize your lifestyle. Robert stood up, his face flushed. James, that's enough. Stephanie has worked incredibly hard on this project, and your grandfather would be ashamed of the way you're speaking to your sister. Something snapped inside me at the mention of my grandfather. My grandfather built a hardware business into a $50 million fortune by making smart decisions and working harder than everyone else. He didn't ask family members to fund his dreams. He earned everything he got. He also had family support, Patricia said, her voice rising for the first time. He had a wife who managed the household so he could focus on business. He had children who worked in the family company, who sacrificed their own interests for the good of the whole. Family means supporting each other, James. Supporting each other? I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. You want to know what Morrison told me about family support? He told me that grandfather left specific instructions that his inheritance should never be used to enable family members who weren't willing to work for their own success. He said, grandfather watched too many wealthy families destroy themselves by throwing money at children and grandchildren who never learned the value of earning something themselves. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This one felt final, like the moment when a bridge burns completely and you realize there's no going back across it. Stephanie's face had gone very pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. So that's it? You're going to let 20 years of planning and work just disappear? Because of some principle? Yes, I said simply. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Robert took a step toward me, his hands clenched at his sides. You are ungrateful, selfish. He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air anyway. Ungrateful for what? I asked. For being raised in a family that apparently views me as a resource to be exploited? For being pressured and manipulated and lied to about grandfather's wishes? For finding out that my own parents inherited $10 million but still thought I should fund their retirement and my sister's business ventures? Patricia stood up, her composure finally cracking. Get out, she said, her voice shaking with rage. Get out of this house and don't come back. Until you're ready to remember what family means. I looked around the living room one last time, at the Persian rugs and oil paintings and crystal figurines that represented generations of Caldwell family history. Then I looked at the 3 people who shared my blood and my name, but who had just revealed themselves to be strangers. I'll remember exactly what family means, I said, turning toward the door. I'll remember that you thought I owed you $20 million because we share DNA. I'll remember that you lied about grandfather's wishes and tried to manipulate me into funding your lifestyle. And I'll remember that when I said no, you threw me out of the house where I grew up. I walked to the foyer and opened the front door. The November air was sharp and clean, a relief after the suffocating atmosphere inside. Don't expect us to be here when you change your mind, Stephanie called after me. I paused in the doorway and looked back at her. I won't be changing my mind. And I won't be expecting anything from any of you ever again. As I walked down the front steps of my childhood home, I could hear raised voices behind me, my family already shifting into damage control mode. But their arguments and recriminations sounded distant, like noise from a house party you're walking away from. I got in my Honda Civic and drove through the winding streets of Beacon Hill, past the gas lamps and brick sidewalks that had been the backdrop of my entire childhood. At the bottom of the hill, I stopped at a red light and pulled out my phone. There were already 3 missed calls from my mother and a text from my father. Don't make a decision you'll regret for the rest of your life. I turned off the phone and put it in the glove compartment. Then I drove toward the highway, toward my apartment in Chicago, toward a life that was about to become entirely my own. Behind me, Boston disappeared into the rearview mirror. Along with 28 years of family expectations and the comfortable illusion that blood relations automatically meant loyalty or love, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe back in Chicago. My Lincoln Park apartment felt different. The familiar sounds of the city, traffic on Lake Shore Drive, the rumble of the L train, voices from the street below, seemed muted, as if I was hearing them through water. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at bank statements and legal documents spread across the surface like pieces of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. The inheritance paperwork from Morrison's office was comprehensive. Tax forms, investment options, trust structures, charitable giving strategies, an entire roadmap for managing wealth that I'd never imagined needing. But what struck me most wasn't the complexity of the financial planning. It was how simple. The core decision actually was I could do whatever I wanted with $50 million. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. For 28 years, my major life decisions had been filtered through family expectations, social conventions, and practical limitations. Where to go to college, what to study, which job offers to accept, all of it had been bound by considerations of money, approval, responsible choices. Now, suddenly, those boundaries had disappeared. My phone had been silent for 3 days. After the confrontation at my parents' house, I'd driven straight through from Boston to Chicago, stopping only for gas and coffee. The 13-hour drive had given me time to think, to process what had happened, to begin planning what came next. But I wasn't ready for contact my family yet. I needed space to make decisions without pressure, manipulation, or guilt. The first step was practical. I needed legal representation that wasn't connected to my family. Morrison had been my grandfather's lawyer for decades, and while he'd been helpful and honest about the inheritance, I couldn't shake the feeling that his primary loyalty was to maintaining family harmony rather than protecting my interests. I spent Tuesday morning researching Chicago law firms that specialized in estate planning and wealth management. The names on the websites were impressive: Harvard Law graduates, former federal prosecutors, partners at white shoe firms who managed portfolios for tech billionaires and hedge fund managers. But I wasn't looking for prestige. I was looking for someone who would help me navigate this new reality without trying to manage my choices. Sarah Chen's office was in a converted warehouse in River North, far from the marble lobbies and mahogany-paneled conference rooms of traditional wealth management firms. Her bio described her as a former public defender who'd transitioned to private practice, specializing in non-traditional approaches to wealth and philanthropy. When I called, she answered her own phone. "Most of my clients inherit money they don't know what to do with," she said during our first meeting that afternoon. "The difference is that most of them don't have family members demanding immediate access to it." I'd given her a brief overview of the situation, the inheritance, my family's expectations, the confrontation. She listened without judgment, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "What do you want to do with the money?" she asked finally. It was the first time anyone had asked me that question without following it immediately with suggestions, expectations, or deadlines. The simplicity of it caught me off guard. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been so focused on what my family wants me to do with it that I haven't really thought about what I want." Sarah nodded. "That's normal. Most people who inherit significant wealth need time to process what it means, what responsibilities it creates, what opportunities it offers. The key is making those decisions from a position of clarity rather than pressure." She recommended that I take at least 6 months before making any major financial commitments. During that time, she suggested, I should focus on 3 things: education, exploration, and documentation. Education meant understanding the full scope of my options, not just traditional investments, but philanthropic strategies, social impact investing, trust structures that could maximize both financial returns and meaningful outcomes. Exploration meant traveling, meeting people, experiencing causes and organizations that might resonate with my values. "Money can be a tool for change," Sarah said, "but only if you understand what kind of change you want to create." Documentation meant keeping detailed records of every interaction related to the inheritance, especially any future contact from my family. "Wealthy families have complicated dynamics," she warned. "Sometimes those dynamics turn legal. You want to be prepared." That evening, I started a journal. Not a diary of feelings and emotions, but a factual record of events, conversations, decisions. I documented the timeline of the inheritance, the demands my family had made, the information Morrison had provided, and my decision to refuse funding the gallery. As I wrote, patterns began to emerge that I hadn't recognized at the moment. My family's approach had been carefully orchestrated: the delayed revelation of the inheritance, the urgent timeline for the gallery decision, the emotional manipulation about family loyalty. They'd treated my potential refusal not as a legitimate choice, but as a problem to be solved through the right combination of pressure and guilt. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research. I read books about philanthropy, studied case histories of major charitable foundations, investigated organizations that aligned with causes I cared about. The more I learned, the more excited I became about the possibilities. My grandfather had built his fortune selling tools, hammers, screwdrivers, materials that helped people build and fix and create. What if I could use his money to provide different kinds of tools? Educational opportunities for kids who couldn't afford college. Startup funding for entrepreneurs from underserved communities. Technology resources for nonprofits trying to maximize their impact. The ideas were energizing in a way that my family's gallery proposal had never been. Instead of subsidizing Stephanie's artistic ambitions, I could fund scholarships for talented students who needed financial support. Instead of investing in Boston real estate, I could back social entrepreneurs working to solve real problems. But I also started to understand why my family had been so confident in their approach. Managing $50 million responsibly wasn't just about writing checks to worthy causes. It required research, due diligence, ongoing oversight, and professional expertise. If I wanted to make a meaningful impact rather than just feel good about spending money, I needed to treat philanthropy like the serious business it was. I began reaching out to program officers at major foundations, directors of social impact organizations, financial advisors who specialized in values-based investing. Each conversation deepened my understanding of how strategic philanthropy worked, but also clarified how much I didn't know. During this period, my family maintained complete silence. No phone calls, no emails, no attempts at reconciliation or further negotiation. The silence felt deliberate, calculated, another form of pressure designed to make me reconsider my decision. But instead of weakening my resolve, it strengthened it. If they could cut off contact so easily, it confirmed that their interest in me was primarily financial. 3 weeks after the confrontation, I received an unexpected call from my grandfather's housekeeper, Maria Santos. She'd worked for him for over 15 years, managing his home in Cambridge and occasionally helping with family gatherings. "Mr. James," she said, her voice warm but cautious, "I hope you don't mind me calling. Mr. Morrison gave me your number. There are some things your grandfather left for you, personal items that weren't part of the legal paperwork." We arranged to meet at my grandfather's house the following weekend. I drove back to Boston on Saturday morning, feeling strange about returning to the city where I'd grown up but avoiding the neighborhoods where my family lived. The house in Cambridge was smaller than my parents' Beacon Hill townhouse, but it felt more lived in, more authentic. My grandfather had moved there after my grandmother died, choosing comfort over prestige. Maria met me at the front door, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. "Your grandfather talked about you a lot, especially in the last year," she said, as we walked through the house. "He was very proud of the man you'd become, of the choices you'd made." In his study, she showed me a wooden box that had been sitting on his desk. Inside were letters he'd written but never sent, including one addressed to me, dated just 2 months before his death. "My dear James," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've inherited more money than any young man should have to manage alone. I hope it doesn't feel like a burden, because that's not what I intended." He wrote about building his business, about the mistakes he'd made and lessons he'd learned, about watching family wealth corrupt some people while inspiring others to greatness. But the paragraph that stopped me cold was near the end. "I've seen what money does to families, how it can turn children into competitors and parents into controllers. I hope that doesn't happen to us, but I fear it might. If it does, remember that the money I'm leaving you isn't payment for being my grandson. It's not a tool for others to use against you. It's a resource for you to use as your conscience directs. Trust your instincts, James. They've served you well so far." Below the letter were legal documents I'd never seen before, detailed instructions my grandfather had left with Morrison about the inheritance, including specific language about protecting my autonomy and preventing family manipulation. He'd anticipated exactly what had happened. Maria also showed me a folder containing letters and documents related to my grandfather's charitable giving. I'd known he was generous, but I hadn't understood the scope of his philanthropy. Over the past decade, he'd quietly funded scholarships, supported local nonprofits, invested in small businesses owned by immigrants and minorities. His approach was methodical, personal, focused on creating opportunities rather than just alleviating symptoms. He always said the best investments were in people, Maria explained. Buildings and equipment can be replaced, but human potential, once it's developed, keeps growing. I spent the rest of the afternoon in his study, reading through files and correspondence, getting to know a side of my grandfather I'd never fully understood. He hadn't just built a business, he'd built a philosophy about how money should be used, about the responsibility that comes with wealth, about the difference between charity and justice. When I finally left Cambridge that evening, I had more than just documents and personal mementos. I had a clearer sense of direction, a framework for thinking about the inheritance that was grounded in my grandfather's values but adapted to my own vision. On the drive back to Chicago, I made a decision that had been forming in my mind for weeks. I wasn't going to spend months agonizing over the perfect philanthropic strategy. I was going to start making a difference immediately, in ways that honored my grandfather's memory while reflecting my own priorities, but I was also going to document everything meticulously, because I had a growing suspicion that my family's silence was temporary. They'd tried pressure and manipulation. When those tactics failed, they'd try something else. I wanted to be ready for whatever came next. Back in my apartment that night, I opened my laptop and began drafting the first of what would become dozens of grant proposals, funding commitments, and partnership agreements. The money was going to be put to work quickly, strategically, and irreversibly. My family has taught me an important lesson about wealth: it reveals character rather than creating it. They'd shown me exactly who they were when they thought I had something they wanted. Now I was going to show them exactly who I was. The first sign that my family's silence was strategic rather than permanent came on a Tuesday morning in January. I was reviewing grant applications at my kitchen table when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. James Caldwell. The voice was crisp, professional. This is Angela Rodriguez from the Boston Globe. I'm working on a story about family inheritance disputes, and I understand you're involved in a situation with the Caldwell estate. I set down my coffee, immediately alert. I'm sorry, who gave you my information? I can't reveal my sources, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to comment on allegations that you've violated your grandfather's wishes regarding the family inheritance. Are you available for an interview? The call lasted less than 2 minutes. I declined the interview and hung up, but the damage was already done. Someone in my family had contacted the press, spinning a narrative about my violation of my grandfather's wishes. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was exactly 3 months since our confrontation, exactly the amount of time it would take to research media contacts and craft a public relations strategy. I called Sarah Chen immediately. This is escalation, she said without hesitation. Media pressure often precedes legal action in family wealth disputes. You need to be prepared for multiple fronts of attack. She was right. Over the next week, I received calls from 2 more reporters, a financial blogger who specialized in inheritance drama, and someone claiming to represent a documentary crew interested in family dynamics and generational wealth. But the media pressure was just the opening move. The real assault began the following Monday when I received a certified letter from Hartwell, Pemberton and Associates, a Boston law firm I'd never heard of. Notice of legal action regarding breach of fiduciary duty and violation of testamentary intent, read the header. The language was dense, technical, but the message was clear. My family was suing me for violating my grandfather's supposed wishes about how inheritance should be used. I read the document 3 times before calling Sarah. The lawsuit was more sophisticated than I'd expected, claiming that while my grandfather had left me the money legally, he had expressed verbal intentions that I share it with the family for specific purposes. They were arguing that by refusing to fund Stephanie's gallery and other family projects, I was violating a moral and legal obligation to honor his true wishes. It's creative, Sarah admitted when we met that afternoon in her office. Legally dubious, but creative. They're essentially trying to create a verbal trust where none exists in writing. The plaintiffs were listed as Robert Caldwell, Patricia Caldwell, and Stephanie Caldwell, but the legal strategy bore the hallmarks of expensive representation. Someone had invested significant money in this lawsuit, which meant they were serious about pursuing it to the end. What are they asking for? I asked. Sarah flipped through the pages. $25 million in damages, plus court costs and attorney fees. They're claiming that your refusal to fund family projects has caused financial harm, emotional distress, and damage to the family's reputation. $25 million. Half of my inheritance, demanded through the legal system after emotional manipulation had failed. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also revealing. They weren't just angry about losing access to my money. They were desperate. Can they win? I asked. Unlikely, but not impossible. Verbal trust cases are notoriously difficult to prove, especially when the supposed trustor is deceased. But they don't necessarily need to win to cause problems. Legal proceedings like this can be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Sometimes the goal is to make fighting more costly than settling. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since leaving Boston. I researched my family's finances. Public records, property assessments, business filings, all the information that's available if you know where to look and have the patience to piece it together. What I found was illuminating. My parents' Beacon Hill townhouse was mortgaged to nearly its full value, despite them owning it for over 20 years. Robert's retirement accounts showed significant withdrawals in recent years. Patricia's consulting business, which she'd started after leaving her corporate job, was barely breaking even. Most telling was Stephanie's financial situation. Her art history degree from Brown had cost over $200,000. Her 2 years in Europe had been funded through a combination of family support and credit cards. Her current credit report, which I could access through legitimate channels since I was considering family investment options, showed significant debt and minimal income. They weren't just entitled. They were broke. The inheritance they'd each received from my grandfather, $10 million for my parents, $2 million for Stephanie, should have provided substantial financial security. But instead of managing it conservatively, they'd apparently used it to maintain lifestyles they couldn't afford on their actual income. This lawsuit wasn't about honoring my grandfather's wishes or maintaining family unity. It was about financial survival disguised as moral obligation. Over the next few weeks, the legal pressure intensified. Discovery requests, depositions, document demands, all the machinery of civil litigation designed to create maximum disruption in my life. But something unexpected happened as I worked with Sarah to respond to their demands. I became more committed to my philanthropic plans, not less. Each hour I spent defending myself against my family's lawsuit was an hour I wasn't spending on education funding, small business development, or community investment. Their greed wasn't just costing me money and stress. It was preventing me from using my grandfather's legacy for meaningful purposes. I made a decision that surprised even Sarah. Instead of minimizing my charitable activities during the lawsuit, I accelerated them. The first major grant went to the Roosevelt Scholars Program, which provided full college scholarships to first-generation students from low-income families. $2 million, enough to fund 40 complete 4-year scholarships. The program director, Dr. Patricia Morales, called me personally to express her gratitude. "These scholarships will change lives," she said. "Not just for the students, but for their families, their communities. This is the kind of investment that creates generational change." The second grant was to the Community Development Financial Institution serving Chicago's South Side, where I'd volunteered occasionally during college. $1.5 million for microloan programs that helped minority entrepreneurs start small businesses. The impact would be immediate and measurable: jobs created, families supported, neighborhoods strengthened. I documented everything meticulously, working with Sarah to ensure that every grant, every donation, every charitable commitment was legally bulletproof and clearly documented. If my family wanted to claim I was violating my grandfather's wishes, I would demonstrate exactly how I was honoring them, but they weren't giving up easily. In March, I received a call from my cousin Bradley, the same Bradley who'd sued the family trust years earlier. "James, I think you should know what's happening," he said, his voice urgent. "Your parents approached me about joining the lawsuit. They're claiming that grandfather's money should be divided equally among all the grandchildren, that his will was influenced by dementia or undue influence." The audacity was stunning. They were now claiming that my grandfather, who'd been mentally sharp until weeks before his death, had been incompetent when he wrote his will. It was both legally risky and personally offensive, but it revealed how far they were willing to go. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them to go to hell," Bradley laughed. "I may have sued the family trust, but that was because I genuinely believed I was being shortchanged. This is just greed. Grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he left you that money." Bradley's refusal to join their lawsuit apparently triggered a new phase of their strategy. Within days, I started receiving calls from other family members, distant cousins, family friends, even former employees of my grandfather's company. Someone was conducting a systematic campaign to gather evidence of my grandfather's supposed intentions to share the inheritance. The calls followed a pattern. The caller would express concern about family harmony, mention conversations they'd supposedly had with my grandfather about the importance of family unity, and subtly suggest that I should reconsider my decision to hoard the inheritance. I documented every call, every conversation, every attempt at pressure or manipulation. Sarah advised me to be polite but non-committal, to avoid saying anything that could be twisted into an admission or promise, but the most revealing call came from William Morrison, my grandfather's longtime lawyer. He was clearly uncomfortable speaking carefully, but he felt obligated to warn me about what was happening. "James, I've been contacted by your family's attorneys," he said. "They're requesting all communications I had with your grandfather regarding the inheritance, claiming They need them for their lawsuit. I wanted you to know that I'll be compiling those materials, but I also wanted you to understand what they'll show. Morrison had detailed notes from multiple conversations with my grandfather about the inheritance. The notes consistently showed that my grandfather had been adamant about leaving me full control of the money, specifically to prevent family interference. He'd considered various trust structures but rejected them all because he wanted to ensure I could use the inheritance according to my own judgment. Your grandfather was very clear about this, Morrison continued. He'd watched other wealthy families tear themselves apart over money, and he believed the solution was individual responsibility rather than collective control. He trusted you specifically because you demonstrated independence and good judgment. The notes would actually strengthen my position in the lawsuit, but Morrison was concerned about the broader implications. Your family's legal team is being very aggressive, he warned. They're claiming that private conversations they had with your grandfather supersede the written will. It's not a strong legal argument, but it's the kind of claim that can create significant procedural complications. By April, the lawsuit had consumed so much time and energy that I made another strategic decision. I hired a private investigator to conduct a comprehensive review of my family's finances and activities. If they were going to attack my character and motives, I wanted to understand their true situation. The investigator's report was devastating. Not only were my parents and sister in worse financial shape than I'd realized, but they'd been using the pending lawsuit as collateral for additional borrowing. They'd taken out loans against their expected settlement, borrowed money from friends and business associates, and committed to financial obligations that they could only meet if they won their case against me. They weren't just suing me for money. They'd created a financial house of cards that would collapse if they lost. The lawsuit had become a necessity for them, not just an opportunity, but the most damaging discovery was evidence that they'd been systematically contacting beneficiaries of my charitable grants, trying to convince them that the donations were inappropriate and might be reversed. They were actively attempting to undermine the very philanthropic work I was doing with my grandfather's money. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, watching the city lights reflect on the water. My family had revealed themselves completely now, not just as people who felt entitled to my money, but as people willing to destroy charitable work, manipulate extended family members, and lie to lawyers and reporters to get what they wanted. They thought they were fighting for their financial future. But what they were really fighting for was the right to control my life, my choices, my grandfather's legacy. And that was a fight I was determined to win. I picked up my phone and called Sarah Chen. I want to countersue, I said. For harassment. For interfering with my charitable activities, for defamation. If they want a legal war, let's give them one. The consequences of their greed were about to unfold in ways they'd never anticipated. The turning point came in early May, buried in the middle of a routine discovery document that Sarah's paralegal almost missed. Among hundreds of pages of financial records my family had been forced to produce was a single bank statement showing a wire transfer for $350,000 to Hartwell, Pemberton and Associates, their law firm. James, look at this date, Sarah said, sliding the document across her desk. This payment was made 3 days before your grandfather's funeral. I stared at the numbers, the implications slowly sinking in. They'd hired expensive lawyers and begun planning this lawsuit before the inheritance had even been formally distributed, before they'd made any attempt to have a reasonable conversation with me about their expectations. This wasn't a reaction to your refusal to fund the gallery, Sarah continued. This was always the plan. They were preparing for legal action from the moment they learned about the inheritance structure. The discovery was a game changer, but it was also just the beginning. As Sarah's team dug deeper into the financial records, a pattern emerged that was far more calculating than simple greed. My family had orchestrated an elaborate financial strategy designed to force my hand, regardless of my personal feelings about their projects. The timeline was particularly revealing. In the weeks following my grandfather's death, while I was grieving and attending memorial services, Robert had been meeting with financial advisors, real estate investors, and legal strategists. Patricia had been researching media contacts and public relations firms. Stephanie had been negotiating contracts for the gallery space, using projected inheritance money as collateral. They'd gambled everything on their ability to control my decisions, and when that control failed, they'd doubled down with legal action. Rather than adjusting their expectations, but the most damaging discovery came from an unexpected source, Stephanie's own digital communications. Modern lawsuits require disclosure of electronic records, including emails, text messages, and social media posts. What Sarah's team found in Stephanie's phone records was a comprehensive archive of family strategy sessions. You need to see this, Sarah said, handing me a printed transcript of text messages between Stephanie and Patricia from December just weeks after my refusal to fund the gallery. "Mom, the lawyer says James can't just ignore grandfather's verbal wishes. If we can prove he intended the money for family projects, we can force him to honor those commitments." "Are you sure about the verbal wishes angle?" James seems to think Morrison told him something different. "Morrison was grandfather's lawyer, not ours. His loyalty is to the estate, not to grandfather's real intentions. We just need to establish a pattern of family financial support and show that James is breaking that pattern." "What about the gallery contracts? Can we still move forward?" "I'm working on bridge financing. If we win the lawsuit, we'll be fine. If we don't, well, we'll deal with that if it happens." The messages continued for months, documenting their legal strategy, their media outreach, their attempts to recruit other family members. But more importantly, they revealed the extent to which they'd committed financially to projects that depended on my inheritance. Stephanie hadn't just put down earnest money on the gallery space. She'd signed a full lease agreement, hired architects, committed to renovation contracts, all based on the assumption that she could force me to fund her project through legal pressure. Robert and Patricia had made similar commitments. They'd borrowed against their inheritance to fund Robert's consulting business, which had been losing money for 2 years. They'd committed to expensive home renovations, luxury travel, and investment opportunities that required immediate capital. The lawsuit wasn't just about getting access to my money. It was about preventing their own financial collapse. Armed with this information, Sarah developed a counterattack strategy that was both elegant and devastating. Instead of simply defending against their claims, we would demonstrate that their entire lawsuit was based on fraudulent premises and bad faith actions. "We're going to request sanctions," Sarah explained. "When plaintiffs file lawsuits they know are frivolous, or when they make material misrepresentations to the court, judges can impose financial penalties. In extreme cases, they can order the plaintiffs to pay the defendants' legal costs." The sanctions motion Sarah filed was a masterpiece of legal argumentation. It documented the timeline of their legal preparation, the evidence of premeditation, the misrepresentations they'd made about my grandfather's supposed verbal wishes. Most damaging, it included excerpts from their own communications showing that they knew their legal claims were weak but were pursuing the lawsuit anyway. But Sarah had an even more strategic insight. "James, I think it's time to consider going public with the real story. Your family has been trying to control the narrative through selective media leaks. We should respond with complete transparency." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Going public would mean exposing the family conflict to scrutiny, but it would also allow me to tell the complete story, including the charitable work I'd been doing with the inheritance. We crafted a comprehensive media strategy. Instead of defensive responses to reporters' questions, I would proactively share the full story through a detailed interview with a respected financial journalist who specialized in inheritance and philanthropy issues. The interview took place in early June, at the offices of the Roosevelt Scholars Program, surrounded by students who were benefiting from the scholarship fund I'd established. The journalist, Marcus Thompson from Forbes, was thorough and fair, asking tough questions about family dynamics while also documenting the impact of my charitable giving. "You've donated over $15 million in the past 6 months, Thompson noted. "That's a significant portion of your inheritance. How do you respond to your family's claims that this goes against your grandfather's wishes?" I showed him copies of my grandfather's personal letters, the documentation Morrison had provided, the evidence of my grandfather's own charitable giving patterns. The contrast between my family's claims and the documentary evidence was stark. "My grandfather built his fortune by making smart decisions and working harder than everyone else," I said. "He didn't expect family members to fund his dreams, and he wouldn't have wanted his money used to subsidize projects that couldn't stand on their own merit." The Forbes article was published online on a Wednesday morning and became the most read story on their website within hours. The headline was perfect: "The $50 million question, when family entitlement meets philanthropic vision." Thompson had done his homework, documenting not just the family conflict but the specific charitable initiatives I'd funded. The Roosevelt Scholars Program, the community development loans, the small business incubators, all presented as examples of strategic philanthropy that created measurable impact, but the article also included damaging details about my family's financial situation, their calculated legal strategy, and their attempts to manipulate media coverage. Thompson had verified the timeline of their lawyer retention, confirmed their financial commitments to projects dependent on my inheritance, and documented their declining financial situation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from other philanthropists, nonprofit directors, financial advisors, and reporters wanting follow-up interviews. The story had struck a nerve, tapping into broader conversations about wealth, family dynamics, And social responsibility. More importantly, the article shifted the legal dynamics dramatically. When a high-profile case becomes a public relations disaster for the plaintiffs, settlement discussions often follow quickly. The call came from Hartwell, Pemberton and Associates the following Monday. Mr. Caldwell, this is Thomas Hartwell. I represent your family in the current litigation. I think it would be beneficial for all parties if we could discuss potential resolutions of this matter. The conversation was brief and professional. Hartwell suggested a mediation session, a neutral setting where both sides could explore settlement options without admitting fault or creating further public spectacle. Sarah and I discussed the offer carefully. Mediation could provide a faster resolution than continued litigation, but it could also legitimize their claims and set a precedent for future demands. What do you want to achieve? Sarah asked. Do you want them to drop the lawsuit and disappear from your life? Do you want them to acknowledge wrongdoing? Do you want financial compensation for the harassment and legal costs? I realized that what I wanted most was something that couldn't be negotiated. I wanted my family to understand that their approach had been fundamentally wrong, not just tactically unsuccessful. I wanted them to see that the inheritance was an opportunity to honor my grandfather's values, not an ATM machine for their lifestyle choices, but I also understood that mediation might be the fastest way to end the conflict and return my focus to philanthropic work. Let's set conditions, I said finally. We'll mediate, but only if they agree in advance to drop all media contact, stop interfering with my charitable activities, and acknowledge that any settlement doesn't validate their legal claims. The mediation was scheduled for July 15th, at a neutral conference facility in downtown Boston. But before that meeting could take place, something unexpected happened that changed everything. On July 8th, Sarah received a call from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that my family was engaged in inheritance fraud, conspiracy, and potentially money laundering related to their borrowing against expected lawsuit proceeds. The federal investigation wasn't something I had initiated or anticipated. Apparently, one of the financial institutions that had loaned money to my parents against their expected settlement had become suspicious about the legitimacy of their claims and reported the transactions to federal authorities. This changes everything, Sarah said when she called to inform me. Federal criminal investigations take precedence over civil litigation. The mediation will have to be postponed, and your family's lawyers will be dealing with much more serious problems than our countersuit. I felt a mixture of vindication and concern. Vindication because the federal investigation validated everything we'd discovered about their calculated, bad faith approach to the inheritance dispute. Concern because federal criminal charges could destroy what remained of our family relationships permanently. But as I thought about the students receiving scholarships, the entrepreneurs starting businesses with microloan funding, the communities benefiting from the development projects I'd supported, I realized that my grandfather's money was already serving its intended purpose. The inheritance had revealed everyone's true character, my family's entitlement and manipulation, my own commitment to meaningful impact. Now the federal investigation would reveal the full extent of their deception. While the charitable work continued to expand its reach, justice was about to be served, but not in the way anyone had expected. The federal courthouse in Boston's Post Office Square was imposing even on a sunny August morning. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, watching as my family entered through the defendant's entrance with their new criminal defense attorneys. The inheritance lawsuit had been indefinitely stayed pending the outcome of the federal charges, and what had begun as a family dispute over money had transformed into a criminal case that could result in prison sentences. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had spent 3 months building a case that was both comprehensive and devastating. The charges against Robert, Patricia, and Stephanie included conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and filing false statements in federal court. The investigation had uncovered a web of financial deception that went far beyond their lawsuit against me. U.S. Attorney Michael Chen stood at the prosecutor's table, his opening statement methodical and precise. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about 3 people who believed they were entitled to money that wasn't theirs, and who were willing to break federal laws to get it. The evidence presentation took 4 days, each revelation more damaging than the last. The FBI had obtained warrants for electronic communications, financial records, and business documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud beginning within weeks of my grandfather's death. The scheme was more elaborate than even Sarah and I had discovered. My family hadn't just planned to sue me for the inheritance. They'd used false representations about their expected lawsuit proceeds to obtain loans from multiple sources, essentially borrowing against money they hoped to steal through legal manipulation. Robert had borrowed $2.3 million from 3 different private lenders, using forged documents that claimed the inheritance lawsuit was virtually certain to succeed. Patricia had obtained a $400,000 line of credit by falsely claiming she was a beneficiary of a trust fund that would be distributed once the family dispute was resolved. Stephanie had convinced two art dealers to provide expensive pieces on consignment, promising payment from her family inheritance settlement. But the most damaging evidence came from their own communications, which the FBI had obtained through warrant searches of their devices. The text messages and emails revealed not just their calculated approach to the lawsuit, but their explicit acknowledgement that their legal claims were fabricated. "We need to be careful about what we say to Morrison," read one email from Patricia. To Robert. "If he testifies that grandfather never expressed any verbal wishes about family sharing, our whole case falls apart. Maybe we should find a way to discourage him from cooperating with James's lawyers." Another exchange between Robert and Stephanie discussed strategies for making the charitable donations look irresponsible, to strengthen their argument that I was violating my grandfather's supposed intentions. Agent Walsh testified about the complexity of the financial fraud, using charts and timelines to show how my family had systematically deceived lenders, business partners, and even their own lawyers about their financial situation and legal prospects. The defendants created a house of cards based on money they didn't have and legal claims they knew were false, Walsh explained to the jury. When Mr. James Caldwell refused to fund their projects, they didn't adjust their expectations. Instead, they doubled down on fraud. The defense strategy was predictably desperate. Robert's attorney argued that the borrowing was based on a good faith belief in their legal claims. Patricia's lawyer claimed she was the victim of financial advice from others. Stephanie's counsel suggested that she was too young and inexperienced to understand the legal implications of her actions, but the prosecution's case was airtight. The FBI had documented not just the false statements and fraudulent loans, but the sophisticated planning that had gone into the scheme. Bank records showed coordination between the defendants, evidence of shared strategy sessions, and deliberate attempts to hide assets and income from creditors. The trial's most dramatic moment came when the prosecution called William Morrison as a witness. My grandfather's longtime lawyer had been subpoenaed to testify about the true nature of my grandfather's intentions regarding the inheritance. Morrison's testimony was devastating to my family's defense. Under oath, he confirmed that my grandfather had never expressed any desire for the inheritance to be shared among family members. In fact, Morrison testified, my grandfather had specifically chosen to give me full control precisely to prevent family interference. Mr. Theodore Caldwell was very clear about his concerns, Morrison testified. He had watched other wealthy families tear themselves apart over money, and he believed the solution was individual responsibility rather than collective control. He chose James specifically because he trusted his judgment and wanted to prevent exactly the kind of family conflict that has occurred. Morrison also revealed that my grandfather had been aware of my family's financial problems and had deliberately structured the inheritance to prevent them from gaining access to large sums of money they might mismanage. Theodore was concerned about enabling dependency, Morrison explained. He believed that giving large inheritances to people who hadn't demonstrated financial responsibility would be harmful rather than helpful. The prosecution then called me as a witness, an experience that was both nerve-wracking and cathartic. I testified about the timeline of events, the pressure and manipulation I'd experienced, and the charitable work I'd undertaken with the inheritance.u.s. Attorney Chen walked me through the documentation of my philanthropic activities, the scholarship programs, small business loans, community development projects, and educational initiatives. The contrast between my use of the inheritance and my family's demands was stark and powerful. Mr. Caldwell, in the 8 months since you received this inheritance, how much have you donated to charitable causes? Chen asked. Approximately $22 million, I replied. And how much have you spent on personal luxury items, real estate, or lifestyle enhancement? Nothing beyond my normal living expenses, I said. I still live in the same apartment, drive the same car, and work at the same job I had before the inheritance. The defense attorneys cross-examined me aggressively, trying to portray my charitable giving as reckless or vindictive. But their questions only reinforced the evidence of my family's entitlement and manipulation. Isn't it true that you gave away this money specifically to prevent your family from having access to it? Stephanie's attorney asked. No, I replied. I donated money to causes that aligned with my grandfather's values and my own commitment to making a positive impact. The timing had nothing to do with my family's demands and everything to do with identifying organizations that could use the funding effectively. The trial's conclusion came after 6 days of testimony and evidence presentation. The jury deliberated. For less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against all 3 defendants, Judge Rebecca Martinez's sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. The federal sentencing guidelines for financial fraud are severe, and the prosecution recommended substantial prison terms for all 3 defendants, but before sentencing, each defendant was given the opportunity to make a statement to the court. The statements revealed more about their character than months of legal proceedings had. Robert stood first, his usual commanding presence diminished by the orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. Your Honor, I want to be clear that I don't accept responsibility for these charges. My family was entitled to that inheritance, and we had every right to pursue it through legal means. The fact that we borrowed against expected settlement proceeds doesn't constitute fraud, it constitutes confidence in our legal position. Even facing federal prison, he remained defiant, unwilling to acknowledge the fundamental wrongness of his actions. Patricia's statement was more emotional but equally unrepentant. Your Honor, I'm a mother who was trying to secure her children's future. James has more money than any 28-year-old should have, and he's wasting it on charities instead of family. We may have made mistakes in how we pursued our rights, but our underlying cause was just. Stephanie's statement was the most revealing of all. Your Honor, I had a vision for something beautiful, something that would benefit the entire Boston arts community. James could have been part of something meaningful, but instead he chose to be selfish and vindictive. If we broke some technical rules in trying to fund that vision, it was only because the system doesn't adequately protect people with legitimate claims against those who hoard wealth. Not one of them expressed genuine remorse, acknowledged the harm they'd caused, or demonstrated any understanding of why their actions were wrong. Even facing federal prison sentences, they remained convinced of their own righteousness. Judge Martinez's sentencing was thorough and pointed. This case involves more than financial fraud, she said. It involves a fundamental violation of trust, family relationships, and legal institutions. The defendants used the legal system as a weapon to extort money they weren't entitled to, and they compounded that abuse by lying to financial institutions and business partners. Robert received 18 months in federal prison plus 3 years of supervised probation. Patricia received 15 months plus probation. Stephanie, as the youngest defendant and technically a first-time offender, received 8 months in prison plus 2 years of probation, but the financial penalties were equally severe. The court ordered full restitution to all the lenders and business partners who had been defrauded, plus forfeiture of any assets obtained through fraudulent means. When combined with their legal fees, the total financial judgment exceeded $4.50 million. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. What I felt was sadness for the family relationships that had been destroyed, for the grandfather who had tried to prevent exactly this kind of conflict, for the waste of time and energy that could have been spent on meaningful work. But I also felt a profound sense of vindication. The federal investigation and criminal trial had confirmed everything I'd suspected about my family's motives and methods. They hadn't been motivated by love, tradition, or genuine concern for my grandfather's wishes. They'd been motivated by greed, entitlement, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth should be used for. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around asking for my reaction to the verdicts and sentences. Sarah had prepared me for this moment, and my statement was brief but clear. Today's outcome validates what I've believed from the beginning, that my grandfather's inheritance was meant to create positive impact, not to subsidize entitlement. While I'm saddened by the destruction of family relationships, I'm committed to continuing the charitable work that honors his memory and values. The federal conviction also meant that the civil lawsuit against me was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. Sarah filed a motion for attorney fees and sanctions, which the court granted in full. My family would be responsible for reimbursing my legal costs, which exceeded $300,000. But more importantly, the criminal conviction meant that my charitable work could continue without interference, manipulation, or legal threats. The inheritance was truly mine to manage according to my conscience and my grandfather's values. That evening, I stood in my grandfather's former study in Cambridge, which I'd inherited along with the house after the legal proceedings concluded. Maria Santos had maintained the property throughout the trial, and it remained exactly as he'd left it. On his desk was the wooden box containing his letters and personal papers, including the letter he'd written to me shortly before his death. I read it again, understanding now why he'd been so concerned about family dynamics and wealth management. "Trust your instincts, James," he'd written. "They've served you well so far." My instincts had been right about everything: my family's motivations, the importance of charitable work, the need to resist pressure and manipulation. The federal trial had vindicated those instincts in the most comprehensive way possible, but the real vindication wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the scholarship recipients who were starting college in the fall, the small business owners who had hired their first employees with microloan funding, the community organizations that were expanding their services with foundation grants. Justice had been served not just through criminal convictions, but through the positive impact that my grandfather's money was creating in the world. That was the legacy he would have wanted, and it was the legacy I was determined to continue. 2 years later, I stood in the auditorium at Roosevelt University, watching 43 students cross the stage to receive their bachelor's degrees. Every single one of them was a recipient of the scholarship program I'd established with my grandfather's inheritance. Their families filled the audience, parents, siblings, grandparents who had never imagined they'd see a college graduation in their family. "James, you should be incredibly proud," Dr. Patricia Morales said, joining me in the back of the auditorium. "These students didn't just get degrees. They got hope, opportunity, and the tools to transform their communities." Among the graduates was Maria Rodriguez, who'd grown up in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood and was heading to medical school in the fall. David Kim, whose parents had immigrated from South Korea with nothing and who'd just accepted a position at Google. Sarah Johnson, a single mother who'd completed her degree in social work while raising 2 children and would be directing a nonprofit serving homeless families. Each story represented not just individual achievement, but generational change. These graduates would become doctors, teachers, engineers, entrepreneurs. Their children would grow up with different expectations, different possibilities. The ripple effects would continue for decades. The scholarship program was just one piece of what had become the Theodore Caldwell Foundation, named in honor of my grandfather's values and vision. Over 2 years, the foundation had distributed $38 million across education, small business development, and community investment initiatives. The microloan program had helped launch 127 small businesses, creating over 400 jobs in underserved communities. The community development grants had funded after-school programs, job training centers, and affordable housing projects that were revitalizing entire neighborhoods, but perhaps most importantly, every initiative was sustainable and scalable. These weren't just charitable donations that provided temporary relief. They were investments in human potential that would continue generating returns long after the initial funding was spent. My family had been released from federal prison 8 months earlier. Robert and Patricia had served their full sentences and were now living in a modest apartment in Quincy, their Beacon Hill townhouse having been sold to pay restitution. Stephanie had been released earlier due to good behavior but was struggling to rebuild her life with a federal conviction on her record. We had no contact. The trial had made reconciliation impossible, not because of my anger, but because they remained fundamentally unchanged by the experience. Even their statements to parole officers showed no genuine understanding of why their actions had been wrong. I'd heard through former family friends that they still believed they'd been justified in their lawsuit, that they'd been victims of an unfair legal system rather than perpetrators of fraud. The federal conviction was something that had happened to them, not something they'd brought on themselves through their choices. Their inability to accept responsibility wasn't surprising, but it was illuminating. It confirmed that their approach to the inheritance had been symptomatic of deeper character flaws, entitlement, manipulation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth should be managed and what family relationships should represent. The contrast with my grandfather's values couldn't have been starker. He'd built his fortune through honest work, smart decisions, and genuine concern for others. His personal papers, which I'd spent months reading after the trial, revealed a man who understood that wealth was a tool for creating opportunity, not a badge of status or a means of control. In one of his journals from the 1990s, he'd written, "Money doesn't change people, it reveals who they already are. The question isn't how much you have, but what you do with what you've been given." That philosophy had guided every decision I'd made with the inheritance. Instead of using the money to enhance my lifestyle or accumulate possessions, I'd used it to enhance other people's opportunities. Instead of hoarding wealth out of insecurity or spending it on luxury out of impulse, I'd invested it strategically in initiatives that would create lasting value. The personal rewards had been unexpected, but profound. Working with scholarship recipients, meeting with social entrepreneurs, visiting community programs funded by the foundation, these experiences had been more fulfilling than any expensive vacation or luxury purchase could have been. I'd also discovered that meaningful philanthropy requires the same skills that build successful businesses: strategic thinking, careful evaluation, ongoing oversight, and constant learning. Managing the foundation had become a second career that was both challenging and deeply satisfying, but the most important lesson wasn't about money management or charitable giving. It was about the difference between family and relatives. My family had revealed themselves to be people who valued me only for what I could provide them. They'd been willing to destroy our relationships, file fraudulent lawsuits, and commit federal crimes rather than accept that I had the right to make my own decisions. Real family, the kind my grandfather had hoped we could be, supports each other's choices even when they don't directly benefit. The real family celebrates success rather than trying to claim ownership of it. The real family understands that love isn't transactional, that loyalty can't be purchased, and that respect has to be earned. I'd found that kind of family in unexpected places. Dr. Morales and her team at the scholarship program had become trusted advisors and genuine friends. The entrepreneurs receiving microloans had taught me about resilience and innovation. The community leaders managing development grants had shown me what authentic leadership looked like. These relationships were based on shared values and mutual respect rather than blood relations or financial obligations. They were proof that family is something you build through your choices, not something you inherit through genetics. Standing in that graduation auditorium, watching students achieve dreams that had seemed impossible just 4 years earlier, I understood what my grandfather had really left me. It wasn't $50 million. It was the opportunity to discover who I truly was when all external pressures were removed. My family had tested my character through their demands and manipulation. The inheritance had tested my values through the choices it made possible. The federal trial had tested my resilience through public scrutiny and family destruction. I'd passed every test by staying true to principles my grandfather had modeled throughout his life: work hard, treat people fairly, use resources responsibly, and never forget that success creates obligations to help others succeed. The money would eventually be gone, distributed to causes and organizations that could use it more effectively than I could save it. But the impact would continue indefinitely, creating opportunities for people who would create opportunities for others, building a legacy that honored my grandfather's memory while reflecting my own values. As the graduation ceremony concluded, and families gathered for celebrations, I thought about a conversation I'd had with Sarah Chin just weeks after the federal trial ended. "Do you ever regret how everything turned out?" she'd asked. The question had been easy to answer then, and it remained easy now. I regretted the pain and destruction that my family's choices had caused. I regretted that my grandfather's death had been followed by conflict rather than unity. I regretted that criminal convictions had been necessary to end the harassment and manipulation, but I didn't regret a single decision I'd made about the inheritance itself. Every scholarship, every microloan, every community grant had been an investment in the kind of world my grandfather would have wanted to see, a world where opportunity was based on merit rather than privilege, where wealth was used to create value rather than display status, where success was measured by impact rather than accumulation. That was the real inheritance my grandfather had left me. Not just money, but the chance to prove that wealth could be a force for justice rather than entitlement, for opportunity rather than inequality, for genuine family values rather than selfish manipulation. The students walking across that graduation stage were living proof that he'd chosen wisely. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.